Hey, everybody. My guest today for return engagement is Christian Westbrook, who is an agricultural researcher, author, and he is the founder of the Ice Age Farmer broadcast, iceagefarmer.com, which looks deeply at the future of our food supply from the agenda to centralize control of food and defile our diets with insects, chemicals, and lab grown meat to those challenges that most inform our response. A rapid move to emergent, decentralized, and regenerative food systems, which he has been advocating for many years. Christian is a permaculturist, homesteader, and a father with a background in artificial intelligence, and I would say a deep love for humanity. Thank you for returning to the show.
It's my pleasure to be back, Bobby. Thanks very much.
So tell us, right now, it's kind of common knowledge that we're headed for a food crisis. Even President Biden sort of announced it, telegraphed it. What are the causes of the food shortage crisis?
That's a big question, Bobby. And we can go back. It's hard to even know where to start with that, because certainly we can go back to even under George W. Bush, right before Obama, liquidating the U.S.'s strategic grain reserves. Of course, even going back further than that, the whole Rockefeller takeover of agriculture and this gradual destruction of the way that humans have grown food since the dawn of time, and replacing it with what we now call modern but highly toxic petrochemical agriculture. And so I would really say that this is a generations long plan, but probably you're asking more about this acute situation. And so that's one where I think governments have been, in fact, it's now bearing out that governments have been overstating, particularly the USDA, have been overstating their stocks for some time. And so we've been sort of cruising for a day of reckoning at any rate. And of course, within the last 2 years, we've had supply chain challenges because of Corona, a series of weather challenges, diesel shortages now, parts shortages, sort of a confluence of things. Even just the inflation itself is a form of real economic trial for farmers. And all of these things together spell a perfect storm that is, as we're seeing, having very real effects on the availability and production of food.
And when you talk about the Rockefeller plan, you're talking about the Green Revolution, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So that as an outset, and then this Green Revolution 2.0. I know you're familiar with Vandana Shiva, and she speaks frequently about the Green Revolution 2.0, where the Gates Foundation has sort of taken off where that Rockefeller agriculture left off, and doing things now to the 21st century, really taking over, trying to patent and own the very genetics that make up our entire ecosystem. So that sort of warfare on all of the vast biodiversity of plants and wildlife that feed us, now it's all being rephrased to animals and even plant life is dirty and dangerous. And that's a phrase that I've used consistently through the years, because that is really the way that they seek to characterize our interaction with animals and our dependence on food that we eat grown in nature. That's not what a transhumanist technocrat wants to see, because anyone can grow food and you can save seeds from heirloom varieties. The abundance that flows from this, and I hope we talk more about how easy and rewarding it is to cultivate food. I think it's something innate to humanity, and it is exactly that relationship with nature and to God that the transhumanists seek to sever when they take from us that ability to cultivate our own food. Even just looking at what makes us who we are. So many of our holidays are tied to the harvest calendar and to our relationship with Earth. And so all of this really spells a reformatting of humanity and overriding it with human 2.0, and food 2.0 is part of that. And that's why we're seeing this war on agriculture, the absolute war on real meat, replacing it with lab meat, replacing the organic good farms with now this technocratic approach, vertical indoor farms, of course, that they were control. So at the core of it, as Kissinger said, this is a bid for total control. His words were, if you control oil, you control nations, but if you control food, you control people. And that, at the end of the day, is really the name of the game right now.
I wrote about a lot of these issues in my book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and particularly about the Gates, the transition from Rockefeller to the Gates Foundation in engineering this broader transition of traditional agriculture, of subsistence agriculture, and particularly in Africa, from sorghum, from barley, from cassava and plantains, etc., to try to integrate African farmers into the kind of globalist agenda by persuading them that the United States and our large corporations like Kraft and McDonald's and Cargill could lift them out of poverty if they will only transition to Monsanto's GMO corn and to Roundup ready agriculture, to chemical fertilizers. And one of the things that Gates has done over the past several years is to finance the construction of supply chains. And by the way, he is heavily invested in all of those companies, in Kraft and McDonald's and Coca-Cola, in Cargill and Monsanto, create a supply chain in Africa, and then to use his economic power and his political power over the WHO to persuade African governments to pressure their own citizens to transition to this kind of agriculture. And, the real, I think, reckoning has happened in Africa during the COVID pandemic, during the lockdowns, when those supply chains were shut down to the United States and the corn was rotting on the dock, and the Africans who believed, the Gates agenda, and Bill Clinton, who promised to go in the 90s to go into those countries and lift them out of poverty. And suddenly we turned off the economic relationships with the United States, and you had 10,000 African children, according to the New York Times, starving to death every month because of the shutdown of agriculture. And I don't want to talk a lot, dominate this. I'm just summarizing kind of all the things that you've been talking about. And you referred to Vandana Shiva and her critique of Bill Gates, because we have seed banks that were created, international seed banks that were created to preserve heritage seeds that humanity has used to grow crops, in some cases for 20,000 generations. And a lot of those seeds were being lost. There was an international effort to preserve them. We preserve them in seed banks around the world, about a dozen seed banks. And somehow Bill Gates has gone and gotten control of those seed banks and is doing genetic engineering on the seeds in order to alter them just enough so that he can patent them. Mm-hmm. And it's a bid to create a new asset class, which is nature, multi-trillion-dollar asset class where all of the commons can be liquidated for cash, can be privatized and owned, including our food. And part of that effort appears to be Gates's crusade to control farmland in our country and around the world. He is now the biggest owner of farmland in the United States. And as you said, part of the agenda seems to be getting human beings off the farm. He's partnered with Apple and Google to create robotic farmers. And it's a very, very kind of sinister agenda.
Without a doubt. A lot of that flows from the Gates Ag One Foundation that was set up just to do exactly what you say. They say, well, we're gonna bring enlightenment to agriculture, enlightenment, and here's our special CRISPR engineered seeds that are gonna give you better yields and keep you coming back for more. Yeah, it's sinister. It only begins to really scratch the surface, if you ask me, of the depth of how evil this agenda really is. Yeah, I mean, you said a lot there, and I'm just trying to think. The seed banks are another example of how they are trying to centralize and then take control over this, really the library of Earth's genetics that have gotten us this far. And that is one thing. I think those efforts are noble, and we should all actually continue to do that. The problem, if you ask me, the problem there was that it was a centralized effort, right? Collecting all of these things in one place, which then afforded him the opportunity to seize control. And that's why I think the key word, as you said at the outset, the key action that we all have to be taking right now is to be doing it ourselves, is to be growing things in our own garden, is to be saving those seeds. And that's, again, this is the way it was done. That's why you have the mortgage lifter heirloom variety of tomatoes, because it actually saved, Uncle Jim Bob's house 3 generations ago, or Granny had her special zucchinis that always were prolific come fall. There were people and stories behind these heirloom varieties, because that's where they all came from, and they've been sort of filtered down to a select few that maybe we recognize, and then the big few varieties that are owned by the seed companies at this point, and they just want to continue to corral people in those directions. So yeah, you're exactly right there.
And another part of that agenda that really gets kind of diabolical is the whole fake food trend, which we're being pressured constantly at restaurants, at grocery stores, through advertising, and through kind of moral rectitude telegraphing and signaling to eat fake foods like Impossible Burgers. And when you actually look into them, they are the opposite of healthy. They're the opposite of environmental friendly, but they again allow these chemists to control our food supply.
That's it. And I'm glad you said they're terrible for us. They're full of phytoestrogens and all sorts of nasty. It just looks like dog food, really, when you look at the ingredient labels. But also it was important that you mentioned it's also terrible for the environment, because all of these products come from this soy protein or pea protein, either of which are farmed in vast monoculture, monocropped farms, which is the beginning. This is the genesis of the problem that we're describing today. That's how we got into a position of food shortage in the first place, was these modern commercial monocropping farms. And that's why we need to be talking more about the return to, again, decentralized and regenerative systems that can be producing for all of us going forward. Absolutely.
And part of when you have a monoculture, the only way it's like a circus for pests. And the only way to preserve monocultures from pests is the intensive use of chemical pesticides. So those Impossible Burgers that you're eating because you think you're being healthy are actually you're just eating glyphosate and neonicotinoids and the worst kind of witch's brew of toxics that you're putting in your system every time you bite into an Impossible Burger.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. Well, a circus of insects, though, is a buffet of cash for Monsanto, right? So there's a reason that these same industries are involved in this takeover of agriculture. They want to be there from the get-go. And even there, I think it's clear at this point that we're at the tail end of a dying, these are not sustainable. And so when I say that, it means you can only sort of play that game and deplete the soil and spray nasty, toxic stuff on your crops and eke out a yield for so long. And we're getting to the end of that paradigm. I mean, not just from the depleted soil, which means that the vegetables in our supermarkets aren't actually nutritious anymore. Not only that, but for example, I saw a story coming out of Florida that said there's a citrus disease that's been gradually taking more and more of the production out of the trees, and at this point, the scientists are frantically working on it, but they're just now trying to extend the life cycle of these trees by a couple more years, and then we'll deal with the problem when we get there, right? So it's a massive case, not just the oranges, but across the board of kicking the can. How long can we get away with these terrible agricultural practices? How long can we get away with shoving animals into unspeakably horrible conditions in these CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations? No one in their right mind would advocate that this kind of monocropping at scale or the CAFOs are the right way to do things, or even a moral way. It's atrocious. And I think everyone would say that. The next step, though, is not just to condemn the way we've been doing it, because that's what's being done, is they're pointing at this thing that they have created and saying this is disgusting. And that's why we need to fail forward into our CRISPR modified fake meat and into our genetically engineered dinosaur. They've actually done there's a few companies, some of which Bill Gates funds, that are looking at taking extinct animal DNA and then recreate, it's like Jurassic Park all over again, recreating meats so you can experience the mouthfeel and unique taste of a woolly mammoth. This is the kind of technocratic nastiness that they want to. That's why I say they're defiling the food supply. All of this is why there's a war on real regenerative practices and on good animal husbandry practices. They just want to point at the nasty things, the CAFOs and all these things that they've created that are terrible, and then say, that's why we have to do away with all animals. I mean, the World Economic Forum actually talks about the post-animal economy. And so when I say there's a war on meat, that's not rhetoric and that's not an exaggeration. This is all actually very much in the open, heading towards that post-animal economy.
We've heard also about food plants being destroyed and food shipments and supply chains. How real is all that?
I mean, I don't know how you would say it's fake. These things are actually exploding. And when you look at the frequency of these events, it was already on an uptick a couple of years ago. And I started talking about how it seems like our food supply.
Give an example of a plant that's been destroyed.
I can give you a litany of examples from grain silos and grain elevators, plenty of barn fires. The port of Beirut is one that's particularly noteworthy because it's not only was it a huge explosion, but it has catapulted Lebanon into a food crisis, in which they've already got an economic crisis, and so the situation is pretty dire down there. But that was a very visual example because that's their main grain reserve right there in the port, which exploded, and so they were up a creek at that point. With the U.S., there's just many more facilities, but there have been sugar refineries, grain elevators, and grain silos, like I said, which means the farmers often have no place to take the wheat when they harvest. And you can find a video that I made that just goes through a long list of these things. In fact, if you go to iceagefarmer.com/fire, there's a map of some number of these events right there. And that's a good, convenient way to pull up the data.
Yeah, I mean, during the COVID crisis, you had the same thing happen to ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine production facilities, including one of the biggest in the world, which was in Taiwan, that was mysteriously burned to the ground in what was called an unsolved arson fire. And, it's hard to even talk about this stuff without even sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's pretty eerie how kind of regularly it's happening.
Yeah, without a doubt. The flip side is if you don't want to talk about this because you're worried that someone will think that you're crazy, there is plenty of open, objective stuff that we can talk about. This is, I would argue, we're now maybe, and this is what's interesting, Bobby, is if we'd had this conversation a year or two ago, it would have been a very different conversation. For one, there weren't already empty shelves. And so a lot of this would have been me saying, look, I'm hearing from farmers that the government is lying. We've got these natural cycles of the sun, which mean we're going to have more challenging seasons ahead. And they're openly talking about it. Look at the food chain reaction game, which is still worth talking about it. But now we're already, the ship has sailed. We're already in the middle of a food crisis. Like you said, we've got Biden, but also Trudeau and the German Chancellor Scholz all saying, yeah, we're going to enter food shortages here. But stunningly, none of them offer any solutions, right? None of them talk about how we did this in World War II and there were victory gardens and we were actually able to contribute using backyard gardens, make an impact, right? Make a meaningful, sizable, impactful difference in our food systems when everyone just went outside of their backyard and had a few square feet of garden space. It doesn't take a whole lot to actually really move the needle on that. And that's something, that's just to really amplify the good news here is that we actually can make a difference. But yeah, so the food chain reaction game was one example of where they sort of tipped the hat here. And so to sort of, the short story there is just as Event 201 looked forward and sort of predicted that there would be a coronavirus outbreak and sort of walked through what the scenario would look like, these tabletop exercises. A similar thing was done by George Soros funded, John Podesta run food chain reaction game in 2015, which looked ahead to the year 2020 and said due to climate change and a series of financial and economic problems, there would be interruptions into the supply chains that would then cause a cascading series of failures in our food supply. And this would cause food prices to rise. And at that point, things would get really crazy because countries would stop exporting their food to other countries. And of course, there are some countries who are net importers, meaning they depend on the exports of other breadbasket countries to feed their people. When the food chain reaction game ran through this, they eventually, after some rounds of deliberation, they got to the point where they said, we need better international cooperation, right? We shouldn't have countries acting on their own behalf. These pesky nation states aren't going to do it. We need global governance to get through these global problems, right? That's of course what they would come up with. And then actually they also said we need a carbon tax. And in Europe, they came up with a meat tax as well. So this was only 6 years ago. And since then, the Rockefeller Foundation has released a paper about resetting the table, the need to fundamentally transform the food systems of the United States. There's a commission called the Eat Lancet Commission, which has been working hand in hand with the World Economic Forum. In fact, they call themselves the Davos of food, and they have been describing how a fundamental transformation, they call it the Great Food Transformation, about how this need to, again, reset all, they always throw in these same keywords, reset the food systems of the planet, the Great Reset, to ensure that we, get to an equitable, sustainable food system. Well, all of that is talking about the changes that you and I are already talking about, moving to fake food, moving off of natural farming because animals are dirty and dangerous. So when you look at the food chain reaction game and these simulations and these plans that are all open, it's actually quite easy to say, there's a group of people that have the means, motive, and have had the opportunity now to make a move to shut down the food production of humanity in order to try and attempt a hostile takeover it. And we're now in the process of that. We're walking through the script that food chain reaction game described.
Let me go back to another thing you talked about, which is the decline of nutrients in food. The fact that we're eating a lot of volume, that there's basically almost nothing healthy that's left in it. If you eat an ear of corn today, a lot of the traditional nutrients and minerals that were part of that bushel, the original bushel, have been leached out by pesticides, and they're simply not available for uptake in the impoverished soils in which these plants are now growing.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have any other kind of data on the decline of nutrients in foods.
I don't have it on me handy. I think there are plenty of actually studies on this. Just taking a look at, if you pick up some greens from the supermarket shelves, what's actually in that at this point, and how do you compare that to if you were growing this in your backyard and you had it immediately upon harvesting it fresh, while there's still living enzymes and all of the nutrients haven't yet started to be metabolized by the plant while it's en route to you, then it's just it's not even comparable. It's just a real superfood in your backyard compared to just dead leaves at the supermarket. Yeah.
What are the central political challenges to solving this issue, or what
I
are
don't
the
think
challenges that are driving it?
Honestly, I don't see a whole lot of leadership left in the U.S. What under any color of, it was under Bush and Obama, we were liquidating our strategic grain reserves and waging complete economic warfare on our farmers. Even under Trump, we opened up the doors and we're shipping as much, record amounts of corn and other grains and soybeans out to China. That's continued under Biden. Biden has waged complete warfare on farmers. One of the first things he did on his first day in office was pass a series of executive orders that told the USDA they needed to go to a net zero carbon emissions, meaning farming has to be complete. It's really crazy what the USDA is putting people through. They're actively moving more land into environmental conservation and taking it out of production. So there's just a long list of things that the Biden administration is doing to make life for farmers very harder, including adding to the inheritance tax so that farms really just can't change hands. And that's war on the generational American farms at the heart of it. So it's a big question. I don't see any real leadership within the U.S. government. I see mostly people that are shepherding through the agenda that's coming down from the WEF and the technocrats at the UN. The United Nations Food Systems Summit described a lot of the things we're talking about today, which was that summit was heavily infiltrated by Gates Foundation funded people. So there's not within the U.S. government. I just don't see a lot of resistance to the food agenda or anywhere. Yeah.
How about on the ground in farm country? Are there any organizations like the Farmers Union, which used to stand up for a lot of these issues? Are there any organizations like that people should support?
There are now many who are standing up and saying, we're in a crisis. We're in a crisis situation. And if we don't have emergency capital issued to farmers so that they can afford the fertilizer to feed these crops and afford the seeds to put in the ground, then there's just not going to be food. And I think this is true of most people around the world, but particularly of Americans. We have lived for so long as we entered the grocery store and see this multicolored, I love the rainbow assortment of all sorts of produce and fruits and vegetables from around the world. That's just always, somehow it's always just been there, which means that a lot of people think that somehow it will always just be there. And right now we're finding that that's not going to be true. So hopefully this is that opportunity where, because of the last 2 years and the way things have gone down, I think it's very hard for anyone who is intellectually honest and looking at the situation in the last few years to say that this was just some accident. It was a series of miscalculations and missteps on their part, and maybe they were wrong about the math. It's like, no, this was a very deliberate, intentional warfare going on our population, and that warfare extends into the domain of food. And so again, the natural reaction for us all is not to depend on the government to save us, but to go out and start those victory gardens and save those seeds, restart this amazing heirloom genetics that make up a resilient food system. It's not just Monsanto seeds for everyone on Earth. It's everybody has something, and maybe yours fails, but that's all right because I've got one now. And that's where true sustainability comes from.
Christian, how do we resist this? If you're the average American family, what should you be doing?
Yeah, so the natural response to a takeover of food production is for us to all start growing food, is to move back to decentralized food production. And I say back to because it is the way that humanity, for most of its existence, has been there, right? We all used to grow some amount of food. And if it was great, because if I had a bad harvest, and that happens sometimes, if I have a bad year, then I can go to my neighbor next door and borrow some of his potatoes and get through the season, plus plant some of those and come back next year, and I can be there for him, vice versa, in a following season. And we've all sort of had our back like that. It's a safety net for our species, as well as just being a very sensible way to do things compared to what we've just been describing in this conversation, which is a completely centralized ownership model where total control lies in the hands of very few people, and they are actively using that to turn it into a toxic food system that's poisoning us. So yeah, the natural reaction is for us all to start growing our own food, for us all to build gardens and get involved with a return to local regenerative food systems. And if I already hear some people saying, well, great, I've got a black thumb, I'm not really one for the garden. The good news here for you is, well, first of all, I would say try it anyway. It's a lot of people are very surprised when they actually go out there and connect with the plants and get their hands dirty at how quickly you learn. And I'm working on a book right now, but I've been working on a YouTube channel for years that is all about getting people to overcome that fear, to really just get out there and try things, and try putting the focus on growing good soil, because when you grow good soil, you almost can't help but produce lots of amazing plants. But getting out there, if you don't want to get, if that's not really your forte or you don't have the space for it, I promise you, whatever your background is, whatever your unique skills, your unique experience is from your life, we need you right now. Like, this is, as I said, we've passed the go point for a global food crisis. And that means that's going to be on top of all these other things we're going through, the economic challenges, they're talking about grids down and other situations. It looks pretty hairy here for a time in the near future here. And so whatever it is that you've experienced in your life, this is the time where you bring that to the table, and we all come. And there are people needed to stand up new websites with shopping carts for the farmer down the street who maybe he had a deal for how to get his food to market before, but because of the supply chain going crazy, he needs a new way to connect directly with consumers in the area. And if you're a web kind of a person, then you can do that. If you're a lawyer, there are plenty of legal challenges facing farmers right now, and there's a need for you to work with your city council to try and grease the skids of a local food systems. Maybe you're able to provide, if not subsidies, then tax breaks for local producers if they sell within the community. Whatever you can do, whatever knowledge of and experience you've got, bring it to the table right now. Try and fix this food system that is in your community around you, so that you guys are better off. That's the bottom line, Bobby, on how as Americans we respond to a global food situation.
Christian, tell us again how people can reach you and support you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a website at iceagefarmer.com where you can find all my reports going back to the very beginning. Somehow I am still on YouTube, but a lot of my videos don't stay on there. So the way to really peruse the depth of research on the zero carbon agenda and all of these food issues and on the solar cycles is on iceagefarmer.com. I've also got the Telegram channel at t.me/iceagefarmer.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I want to invite you to post anything that YouTube takes off. We would love to have it on CHD TV, and we would love to give you a place to talk to the public reliably on our network. So keep that in mind, and thank you again for your work, for this invaluable information.
I will keep that in mind. I appreciate it, and thanks very much.
Christian Westbrook, thank you for your activism and for your thoughtful opposition to this coup d'etat against our food supply and against humanity and democracy and national sovereignty and all the other weird stuff that's going on now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.